All right, so today we're going to take a look at some landscape photo editing. Today we're going to take a look at landscape photo editing and some of the methods that I like to use in my work. I had a guy reach out to me on Instagram asking how he can take a certain section of an image, a certain set of colors within an image, and how he can bring those out to accentuate those a little bit further. So I asked him to send me a couple of images that we can use as an example, and he sent me this one here that he said he shot at the Garden of the Gods in Colorado. This is from a user named Anupam Ghosh. I'm sorry, I'm probably completely butchering that name, and for that I apologize. Anyway, let's dive right in. So here's the image here. We've got these nice textured orangish reddish rocks here in the center of the frame. The first thing I notice is it looks like it was shot kind of midday, 11 noon, 1 p.m., somewhere within there. You can tell with the shadows being very short, nothing's really elongated or accentuated, that it's close to that middle of the day. And while that's not the best time of the day to shoot, certainly we always want that lower, longer, warmer light that the early morning or evening hours will give us. Sometimes you just don't have that luxury, especially if you're on a vacation or you're on a short trip and you're at the location and it's noon, and what are you gonna do? You got the choice, either shoot what you can, take what you got with that situation, or pass it up, and I always favor take the shot, can't hurt. So anyway, the first thing I see is that, and as well as the fact that this image is kind of dead center in the frame. Sometimes that works, but usually we wanna, at minimum, stick to the rule of thirds and position this thing somewhere where the main element overlaps on one of the thirds, the grid lines where those intersect. So let me show you. If we go to the crop tool here in Lightroom, the default overlay is that rule of thirds grid. So for me, I want to take this image and start to accentuate this main rock in the middle here. I might bring this down here, bring this just a little bit over until we get that thing perfectly lined up. And for me, that looks pretty good. Now that at least gives us a little bit less of that sky and focuses the eye more in the center of this rock, the main subject of the photo. Now, the first thing I like to do with something like this is take a look at the histogram up here in the top right. And what it's showing me is that there's quite a bit of highlights in this exposure, as you can see by this tall ramp on the right, but there's nothing that touches the edge. So I know it's a well-exposed image, nothing's clipped on the highlights there. So I always like to take a look and see how much data is in the sky, just to know what I have to work with. So I'll pull that exposure down. You can start to see that there is a lot of texture and color in those clouds. I'll put that back to where it was. And with that, I'll pull down these highlights all the way and see what I can recover. And there's a fair amount that happens when I bring that down, and it's also not affecting this rock too dramatically and creating a low contrast situation. So I'm going to keep that a little bit lower on the highlights. The second thing I like to do is bring up the shadows and see if there's more detail I can pull out of those at the same time as I push these blacks back down. Now, in a lot of ways, all that's really doing is increasing the contrast of the image. And I can show you that if I reset these here and just pull this contrast slider. It's having a pretty similar effect on the image. What I don't like about this is I don't have quite as much control over that balance between shadow and highlight. So I always like to just do that a little bit more manually, if you will, by bumping the shadows up, pushing the blacks down until I'm happy with how that goes, and I'm not crushing the blacks too deeply. The next thing, sticking to the request here, is if I'm focused on bringing out these orange colors and the highlights and textures of these rocks, I am getting a little bit distracted by this sort of bluish cyan background over here. So to compensate for that, what I think I'll do is in the HSL color tab section, I'll go to my saturation and I'll pull this blue all the way down and see what happens. And obviously we don't want a black and white background, that doesn't look all that natural, but a little bit less of that blue starts to bring the attention back to the foreground, which is what we're after. And the other thing I can do with that is bring the luminance of that same blue channel down to push that a little bit darker, push that back further into the background, and at the same time, get a little bit more definition out of the sky. Now, when I do that though, you'll notice everything gets a little bit darker, a little bit more desaturated. So it's this balance of pushing that back and bringing the color back in until you feel like it looks natural enough while still accentuating the parts of the image that you wanted. So I'm gonna call that good right about there. The next thing I noticed with this image here is now I've created this big open area in the top left portion of the image. And while that's not necessarily the worst thing, I do want to bring a little bit less attention to that, again, by darkening that up a little bit, just making this rock be the thing that really stands out in the image. So to do that, I'm going to grab my graduated filter tool here and just draw an area that roughly covers that section of the sky. And I'll bring that exposure down a little bit. I'll bring those highlights down just a little bit in that area, and it's not going to do much. It will be subtle. You'll start to notice a little bit of darkening in just that top left area. And as I said, you won't notice it very much. It is really subtle, but that is the key here. We want to keep things subtle and realistic, just enough that you as the editor notice this, but a viewer may not pick up on these things. Now, if I went way too far and pulled this exposure, that's what we want to avoid. That's way too unnatural, way too obvious. So I'll pull that back to right about here, and I think that looks good. Hit done. The next thing I want to do is address the colors of the greens here. I don't personally mind the look of this. I know a lot of people, especially lately, tend to like a little bit more of a desaturated or a yellowish or darker look to that, which we can do again with this HSL slider area. I'm going to start by pulling the saturation of these greens down just a little bit. Make that not quite so vibrant, and again, the same thing with the luminance, just to darken that up a little bit. And I think that looks pretty good. The next thing I want to do is really start to bring out some of the highlights and the textures of these rocks. If we look closely at this, because of the fact that it was shot at high noon or near to that time, we have a lot of really hard contrast between the deepest shadows and the shadow sides of the rocks here. But on the highlight sides, there's really not a lot of differentiation in between the highlights and the midtones and some of the shadows. So we want to do what we can to accentuate that contrast and the texture. So first thing I'll do is start by playing with the orange and yellow luminance sliders here, because those are the dominant colors I see within these rocks. And what I like to do is just bring one all the way up and all the way down and just see what effect that has on the image. And in this case, I really like the fact that if we look at the rocks specifically, the highlights of these rocks really start to come to life with the yellow luminance going all the way up, as well as the trees down below. They really start to take a little bit more of that low light look to it. So I'm going to find a nice balance here with that and call that good. And I'll do the same with the orange as well and just see how that affects things. Certainly on the extreme ends of this, on the bringing it all the way down and bringing it all the way up, both look quite terrible, really. So if I bring this back to the middle and just do that a little bit more subtly, I think bringing this one up actually makes everything a little too bright. Bringing it down adds just a little bit more to that contrast. So I'm going to bring that down to about -4 and call it good. So by this point, things are starting to look a little bit better than they were originally. I still want to bring a little bit more attention to this section of the image, since that's our real main focus. To do so, I like to use a classic vignette. I'm not talking about the pre-built ones down here where you can just bring this slider and make our circular vignette. I like a little bit more control over that. So what I'll do is, using this radial filter tool, I'll just start to draw a radius around the section that I really want to highlight and get that positioned so it's mostly in the center. The object that I want to highlight is in the center, in this case these rocks. I'll bring all of the adjustment sliders on that back down to 0 and just subtly bring that exposure down so everywhere outside of that gradient the radial gradient starts to get a little bit darker, in effect creating our own vignette. And again, subtlety is the key here. You want to see it enough to have the effect, but not so much that you really notice that it's being done. So I'm gonna call that good right there. And then lastly, I want to even further accentuate the textures in these rocks. So I could just globally apply some sharpening to this image, and you'll start to see if I do that, I mean, if I take it way too far, the rocks themselves start to look a little bit more like how I want it, but it also introduces a lot more noise in areas where I don't. So I'm gonna put that back to where it was, and instead use a new brush tool and bring my sharpness up fairly high on that as well. Make sure that I've got a nice feathered edge, pull that all the way to 100. The flow, put that about 50, and the size, we'll just adjust that relative to the area that I'm working on. In this case, this looks about like what I want. If that was a little bit smaller, just to show you here, that's going to start making, when I make the brush strokes on here, you'll start to see the strokes themselves rather than the effect. And on the opposite side of that, if it's a little bit too large and I were to do this, it's going to be affecting areas that I don't want affected, like the sky in the background. So I'll just bring that back down to a size about the area that I'm working with, and that looks good. And then all I'm going to do is just start painting that in carefully on the areas that I want to accentuate the textures of. And again, it's very subtle here, but if you start to notice, these rocks that I'm touching are starting to get just a little bit more texture, a little bit more sharpness to them, and helping them pop off the background just that little bit more. Do the same one here. And I'm actually going to intentionally leave these ones in the foreground alone. I'm okay with those being a little bit blurrier or not quite as sharp as the others. Even if that depth of field is not really blurring these out very much, or compression depending on the lens he used, I'm okay with it looking like that a little bit. Okay, and when I'm happy with the painting there, I'm gonna hit done on this, and that looks pretty good. Now the last thing here, is all of the people. And this is a common problem when you're dealing with a very touristy area or an attraction like this. It's near impossible to get it without the crowds of people. So we can either wait and wait and wait for that perfect opportunity, or take this into Photoshop and start to remove some of these people. I prefer the latter. So to do that, I'm just going to right click on the thumbnail that I'm working on and hit edit in and choose Photoshop. Looking at this in Photoshop, if I zoom into this area, I see there's quite a bit going on here. I may not be able to really cleanly remove all of these people, but I'm going to show you at least a couple different ways that we could do this. The first of which is by far the easiest and more often than not yields really good results, and that's just using the content aware fill. So to do so, I'm going to grab my lasso tool and just draw an area roughly around the person and the shadow that I want to remove, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Just highlight that, then holding shift and I hit delete, it'll bring up the option of how I want to fill that area. And in this case, I want the content aware. So we'll choose that, hit OK, and there you go. If I deselect this, that's pretty good. You're probably never going to notice that, especially on a zoomed out version of that image. That guy is all but disappeared. So we can do the same thing to other areas of this image and just see what kind of results we get with it. In this case, where I'm kind of drawing around these people and around these rocks, I'm going to try to be a little bit more precise around where they overlap that rock, particularly this, what I assume is a kid here. Where it comes down around this rock, I want to follow that shape pretty closely. And again, if I hold shift, hit delete, and choose content aware for my fill, we'll let Photoshop analyze it. In this case, it didn't do the greatest job. It left a little bit of artifacts here, but that's okay. It's close enough that I think what we'll do is leave this as is, and then use my clone stamping tool, which shortcut S, or we select this tool here. And I'll try to find an area in this image that I know resembles the same area that I want to paint in. In this case, there's kind of a nice line along this ridge here that I'll set as my target area. Let's choose right about here. Bring my brush down to a little bit smaller size, and when I come back over here, I'll just try to line up where that starts and paint over those artifacts. And again, it's not perfect, but no one's ever going to notice the difference there. And we can keep just repeating this process over and over until we start to get these people really cleaned up and really dialed in. A lot of this is a matter of preference and the image that you're working with, of how you really want to edit these. So if I'm looking at this section right about here, the content aware fill might work pretty well, especially if I follow this rock edge nice and closely. Paint around that person quickly. Again, Shift Delete, pulls up content aware, hit OK. And that one did a pretty good job. Same thing with this guy up here, kind of tucked behind the rock. I'll follow that tight edge here, paint around the person, Shift Delete. And there we go. Now, some of these we might have to cheat a little bit and use the clone stamp to fill in a little bit more than reality, to essentially cover up the people, as is the case with these guys hiding here behind the tree. So what I'll do is find an area, again, that I kind of like the look of and will blend in with the shapes, but also gives me some nice edges to work with. In this case, I'm looking at this part of the tree here. If you look, it's kind of a cluster of leaves around that edge, and that's essentially what I want to copy. To give you an idea, I could very carefully come in with my tool and select this whole thing here, make sure that that's absolutely perfect, and then copy and paste that and just kind of bring that over where I'm working. But it's just never going to look that good. So instead, I'll grab my clone stamp tool. Again, shortcut key is S, or click the tool here. I'll set my reference point by holding Option on a Mac and click here. And I'll start painting over these people. And my goal here is to try to create an edge that is soft enough that you don't notice as much, but hard enough that it looks realistic. And now, when I did that, I grabbed some of these branches down below, and that obviously looks a little bit out of place. So I'm gonna undo that piece and use a combination of the two. Grab my lasso tool, we'll paint back in over these remaining bits of people here. Again, Shift Delete, content aware fill. And I got just this little bit of the person left over here that I could try a content aware again, or I could clone stamp, whichever one yields a better result. Let's take a look. And the content aware, that did a pretty good job, so I'm happy with that. Now I'm just gonna go through and finish the rest of this, remove all these people so we can move on to the final steps of this image. Okay, so now that I've got all the people removed from this image, I can hit save on this. It will update the image in Lightroom and allow us to pick up right where we left off. Really the last thing I want to do with this is, I'm a big fan of vignettes, subtle vignettes. Do exactly what I told you not to earlier in this video, and using this post-crop vignetting, just put a little bit more into the corners here to really accentuate that rock. I'll pull that down to about -13, it looks like. That looks good to me. And that's it. We can save, export this, make additional crops, whatever you want to do with it next, but there's the final image. Just to give you an idea of the before and after of what we're dealing with, here's obviously the completed image that we just made compared to the original. Completed. Original. So while not the best situations for shooting, I think we still ended up with a very usable, worthy image. through just a little bit of editing and some painstaking removal of all of the tourists. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned something through this quick little editing. Just kind of proves that even if you have an image that you might have easily passed over in your library when you're scrolling through all the thumbnails of the shots that you took for the day, there's a lot that can be recovered with just a little bit of editing and some patience in removing all the people. So again, thank you, Mr. Ghosh. Apologies again if I'm completely butchering your name, but I'm glad you sent this through. Hopefully you learned something, and if you could, do me the favor and hit subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. Any support you can give me when we're just getting started out with this is motivation for me to continue moving forward. Thanks, guys.